In 1970s California, Randy Kraft was a man of many guises: military veteran, computer whiz, party animal, and prolific serial killer.
What sets Mr. Kraft apart from other killers is the volume of his victims.
The young men Kraft targeted suffered a cruel and unusual fate.
He wanted those young men to really, really suffer, and he enjoyed it.
It would be unimaginable to a normal human mind what occurred.
With no leads and little evidence, the spate of horrific murders continued for 11 long years.
These were a bunch of unsolved cases, bad unsolved cases.
When Kraft was finally caught red-handed, the police realized the extent of his depravity.
So the prosecutor found a list in the trunk of his car that was a coded reference to his victims.
Dubbed the scorecard killer, Randy Kraft was a methodical, determined sadist and undoubtedly one of the world's most evil killers. Shortly after 1 a.m. on May the 14th, 1983, two highway patrol officers pulled over a car being driven erratically on the I-5 freeway in Mission Viejo, California. The driver was 38-year-old Randy Kraft.
They test Randy Kraft's alcohol level and announce, of course, that he is drunk. And then they say, what about the passenger, who appears to be asleep?
The officer who went around to the passenger's side of the car realized very quickly this was no ordinary driving offense.
And he tried to wake him up, wasn't successful, opened the door. The young man's pants were pulled down to his knees, and he was dead.
A regular traffic stop had just become a major murder inquiry, and the driver of the car was at the center of it. This killer's story begins on the west coast of America, in Southern California.
Randy Kraft was born in March of 1945 in Long Beach, California.
Randy had a very religious upbringing, and his family was pretty devout.
Kraft was the youngest of 4 children and his parents' only son.
He was doted on by his mother and 3 elder sisters. Very much the sort of mother's boy.
When Randy Kraft was 3 years old, his family moved from Long Beach to Midway City in neighboring Orange County, where Kraft was enrolled in a local school.
He was a good student. He was bright and academic.
He was on the high school tennis team. Played saxophone, pretty good saxophone player. He had good friends.
He went to Claremont College in California, which is rather respectable, very reputable college, to study economics. He was talkative, gregarious, quite thoughtful.
He's a very competitive guy. Loved to play cards and hated to lose. One thing about Randy was nobody ever remembers him sleeping.
It was during his time at college in the mid-1960s that Kraft started to engage in high-risk behavior.
In spite of this really rather level childhood and adolescence, sort of began to go off the rails in his final year at Claremont.
He started drinking quite heavily and taking drugs and gambling, all of those kind of instant gratification things.
It was as if he wanted to throw off the past and he suddenly wanted to become, oh, I'm going to become my own man.
Since adolescence, Kraft had been coming to terms with his own sexuality.
For a while in high school, he dated women, although subsequently came out as gay.
Being a gay man, it would have been very, very difficult back then. A lot of prejudice and discrimination. in those days. As he went into the more liberal college environment, he became more comfortable.
Kraft threw himself into his new lifestyle.
Frequented gay bars, picked up male hustlers. He made no secret of it to those who knew.
At that point, he was definitely experimenting with how this was going to impact his life.
In 1966, Kraft was arrested for lewd conduct after propositioning an undercover police officer, but was let off with a warning. It was the first of many incidents that demonstrated to Kraft that his sexuality would not be universally accepted.
After he graduated from college and came out to his parents, his father just had a fit and refused to talk to him for a while.
After college, Kraft ventured into the world of full-time employment and, at the age of 23, embarked upon a career in the military.
Randy Kraft was in the United States Air Force in 1968. His rank was Airman First Class.
He was good at discipline, good at order, was quite successful.
Not a combat role, actually was painting test jets at Edwards Air Force Base.
At that time, gay men were not permitted to serve in the military. Despite this, Kraft revealed his sexuality to his superiors. On July the 26th, 1969, he received a general discharge from the service with medical grounds being cited as the reason.
General discharge is different than an honorable discharge.
Kraft objected to his discharge, but was told he had no grounds. So he goes back to home to live with his parents. I wouldn't have said it was a very happy return.
We see that potentially his sexuality has had a massively detrimental effect on his future career and his aspirations.
24-year-old Randy Kraft got a job as a bartender at a local gay bar known as The Mug. Here, at closing time, he would pick up men for late-night sexual liaisons, heading to one of the many beaches of the Southern Californian coastline.
And this is the point that his offending starts. He really starts to escalate in the risks to himself and other people.
In March 1970, Kraft, now living with a housemate, picked up a 13-year-old boy near Huntington Beach.
He started talking to this boy, and he says, "Hey, you want to come back to my car and have a beer?"
The child told Kraft that he'd run away from home that day. Kraft invited the boy back to his apartment in Long Beach, where events took a horrifying turn.
The boy is plied with drugs and alcohol.
And once he got him to the home, he gave him some Valium.
Valium is generally used as a minor tranquilizer. In combination with drugs such as alcohol, can so depress the brain that the person may either lose consciousness or at least lose a level of consciousness and not be able to act normally or have normal judgment or defend themselves.
He was very soon semi-conscious, unable to resist any force that Mr. Kraft would apply.
While the boy was powerless, Randy Kraft forced him to perform a sex act on him. Kraft then went on to violently sexually assault the teenager while he was too sedated to fight back.
He sexually assaulted a 13-year-old boy, a child, who was incredibly vulnerable. This is not an insignificant crime. This is the first insight we get now that this man is escalating in risk significantly.
After the attack, Kraft carried on his day as normal.
And Randy Kraft left and went to work. The kid is just mortified and he's scared to death.
The boy is traumatized by the events. He escaped and got help.
Members of the public were quick to help the clearly intoxicated boy and call the emergency services.
And the police come, and they take him to the hospital, and they pump his stomach. They take a story. The kid never told the cops that he'd been sexually molested. He just said he'd been abducted and given this alcoholist.
With the police unaware of exactly what had happened at the apartment, Randy Kraft got away with brutally assaulting the child. The attack would come to be recognized as a practice run for the pattern of sadistic offending that would come to define Kraft's crimes.
He's an extreme sexual deviant, and he unfortunately gets gratification from ways that aren't normal.
Free to roam the streets of Southern California, it was only a matter of time before Kraft took the opportunity to strike again. With his veneer of respectability intact, Randy Kraft pursued a career in the newly emerging computer industry.
Computers were just into existence, but he was a whiz at computers already then. That was his forte.
He was a smart enough guy. If you'd have met him at a party, you might think he was a little high-strung, but he seemed like a regular person. And he had a social demeanor about him that would get him by.
So he's developed by 1970 into A, a respectable computer scientist, B, a gregarious young man, and C, into a secret life. He still goes to gay bars and he still picks up male prostitutes.
On the 5th of October 1971, around 60 miles from Kraft's home in Long Beach, a naked body was discovered close to the Ortega Highway.
The body of a young man called Wayne Duckett is discovered. He's a 30-year-old gay bartender. He worked in a bar called The Stables.
The man had been missing for 2 weeks. His body was too decomposed for police to ascertain foul play, and his death was put down to acute alcohol poisoning. But it would turn out to be the first death in a disturbing epidemic.
From about the early 70s, bodies started appearing, young men who'd been murdered.
Several of them were found dumped along the freeway with road burns that looks like they'd been kicked out of a moving car.
In 1972, there was another victim, a 20-year-old Marine, Edward Moore. He was discovered around Christmas near the off-ramp of a freeway. He'd been beaten and strangled.
6 weeks later, a man in his late teens or early 20s was found alongside the Terminal Island Freeway in Wilmington. He'd been strangled with a ligature. 2 months after this, in April 1973, the body of 17-year-old Kevin Clark Bailey was found in Huntington Beach.
He was the first one to be mutilated. He was suffocated.
I believe the genitalia were cut off.
Though each death was a tragedy and each was investigated by the police, there was no panic at this time that a serial killer was responsible. The murders occurring across Southern California's vast road network were not immediately linked. 8 days after Kevin Bailey's murder, another body was found of an unidentified young man. He'd been dismembered. 3 months later, in July 1973, 20-year-old Ronald Weeb went missing.
Ronald left his mother's house to go to a bar and disappeared. He was found 2 days later. He's been strangled and sexually assaulted.
Over the next 18 months, 4 more young men were discovered murdered beside or close to major roadways in Southern California. Vincent Cruz Mestas, Malcolm Eugene Little, James Dale Reeves, and Roger Edward Dickerson.
It was quite difficult for the police to link all of these murders together at the time because there didn't appear to be any strict consistency in the way those people were killed.
Some had been strangled, others asphyxiated. Some had been beaten or tortured. More than one victim had been restrained or even suspended by their wrists and ankles.
But certainly some of them were sexually assaulted. There was physical evidence for that.
At least 2 of the bodies, maybe more, had socks stuffed up their rectum.
Some of the victims were sexually mutilated, and that was obviously a striking finding.
Apart from the fact they were all young men, there was also little to link the victims.
Many of the victims were Marines, and they didn't come from Orange County, or hitchhikers, and there wasn't this great alarm.
Some of them were gay, some of them were vulnerable in other ways. Maybe they were homeless, maybe they were runaways.
It was the time of the Vietnam War when thousands of young men would have been away from home, their whereabouts hard to track for their loved ones.
The fact they didn't come from Orange County, they come from, where they were drafted from in Wisconsin or Alabama or Colorado or wherever they came from. It wasn't a local boy.
All of the murdered men had been alone when they'd been picked up by their killer. There were no witnesses and no clues to link them to any suspects.
These are perfectly innocent people who have fallen into the hands of what can only be called a monster.
And the monster had no intention of stopping. In January 1975, the bodies of high school student John Layrus and 21-year-old Craig Johnitis were found along the same stretch of coastline. Both had been strangled with signs of a sadistic sexual motivation.
The same modus operandi applied to both. They were young men and they were dumped.
By this time, with 14 unsolved homicides across 4 counties in less than 4 years, police had come to the horrifying realization they could all be the work of one serial killer. Local law enforcement called in specialist investigators.
A task force has been set up to see if they can track down whoever's doing it. They have an FBI profiler.
The FBI told detectives they were likely looking for a methodical, organized lust killer of above-average intelligence.
They thought they might have had prior convictions or had been sent to a mental facility.
The task force came up empty-handed. But that spring, though they did not realize it, the police came agonizingly close to catching their killer. On the 29th of March 1975, 19-year-old Keith Crotwell and a 15-year-old friend were part of a group of teens drinking in a parking lot in Long Beach.
Soon they noticed this weird guy staring at them across the parking lot. He's 5'10", about 140 pounds, short haircut, and very unassuming, but a great talker. Hey, you guys want some beer?
He ended up being able to talk these individuals to getting in his car and leaving. We don't know why.
The friends accepted a ride. They also accepted the Valium the man offered them from a stash in his car, quickly becoming intoxicated. Sometime later, the car returned to the parking lot.
He apparently did not want to deal with 2 people. Drives back to the parking lot near the Grenada and the Belmont Shores.
And the friend is literally thrown out of the car and Crotwell is kept.
Keith Crotwell never came home.
Keith was missing for 6 weeks before his terrible fate became clear.
What was found of Keith was his head, which was found in Long Beach Marina.
Keith Crotwell's devastated friends turned detective, tracking down the stranger's distinctive vehicle.
Some friends who'd seen Crotwell and his buddy get into the car identified it. And the police, for the first time, interviewed Randy Kraft.
30-year-old Kraft told officers he and Crotwell had driven around for a while until the car got stuck in mud on a dirt road.
Once he got the car stuck, Crotwell had just gone, and he was left with the car.
To investigating officers, Kraft's story was far from watertight.
Maybe this guy killed Keith Cotwell. So the cops take the case to the Los Angeles County DA's office and says, we want to file a murder charge against Randy Kraft.
The prosecutor refused. The police had no physical evidence and no murder weapon. Keith Crotwell's death was filed as a potential drowning, and Randy Kraft remained free to haunt the streets of Southern California.
There was no body. There was no evidence.
When a killer is able to keep killing and nobody seems to notice and nobody comes knocking on his door and they're not arrested, then of course they're going to become emboldened. He just kept getting away with it. And when you get away with something, you become bulletproof in your own head.
Both investigators and Keith Crotwell's friends were sure that Kraft had killed and decapitated the teenager. A month later, in June 1975, Randy Kraft was arrested for lewd conduct and spent 5 days in jail. In October 1975, skeletal remains were found close to where Kraft said he'd last seen Keith Crotwell, but they would not be identified as the teens until 1983. After a 7-month hiatus in the spate of violent sexual murders that had plagued the area, another young man disappeared.
The next victim was a man called Mark Hall. It was New Year's Eve 1975. He'd been to a number of parties.
And they were drinking, and his friend was continuing to party, and he noticed Mark Howard Hall pass out on the couch.
When 22-year-old Mark's body was found 3 days later and almost 60 miles away, it was clear that Randy Kraft had escalated in his horrendous brutality.
He had been tortured and sexually molested over an extended period of time.
His genitals had been emasculated, and a lot of sand and mud was found in his mouth and in his throat.
The victim had been traumatized while he's still alive. It was called ante-mortem, before death. The victim was horribly tortured, including the cigarette was punched in the cigarette lighter and heated up and burned him on several parts of his body. On his left nipple, on the upper torso, on his face, on his eyes. So the victim couldn't close his eyes to what was happening to him, the torture was happening to him.
When people kill serially, they are inevitably going to develop their technique. Some people may use torture or sadism. They want that person to really suffer, and they may experiment as they find sadism actually pleases them.
Who knows how much horror these young men went through before they were killed?
It's a tragedy. Nobody knew how he disappeared. He was simply at a party and then he wasn't there anymore.
Toxicology tests revealed Mark Hall's blood alcohol level was fatally high at 0.67%. Valium was also found in his system.
I don't think anybody could drink that much. That sounds like somebody pouring alcohol down his throat.
A level of drugs such as alcohol could render a person unconscious, when combined with Valium, could be lethal.
Many aspects of the murder were familiar to investigators: the intoxication, torture, and extreme sexual violence. But Mark Hall's murder bore a novel feature. Kraft had tied him to a small tree, posed for whoever would find him.
He got some sort of a thrill out of advertising it. He wanted to shock people who saw the bodies. Why would you pose it?
He was proud of what he was doing.
The 1970s would be seen in hindsight as a risky time to be a young man in Southern California. As well as the many victims found castrated, sodomized, and tortured, there were dozens of other unsolved murders of young men and teenage boys who'd been picked up on the network of freeways. In 1977, a man named Patrick Kearney handed himself in to police in Riverside, California.
And he was known as the trash bag killer because his bodies were mainly dumped in trash bags.
Kearney admitted to killing 35 men. The following year, he was given 21 life sentences and imprisoned at San Quentin. Detectives hoped that young men would now be safe from attack. But in reality, they were far from certain that Kearney was responsible for all of the unsolved murders on their books. For a start, his method of killing was always a gunshot to the temple.
The police will be heavily reliant on their linkage analysis, so they have to find consistencies across all of these bodies that were appearing.
Patrick Kearney did not torture or maim the victims. Patrick Kearney said, "I'm not the stake in the butt kind of guy. I'm not him. I'm not the worst of the worst. This other guy is."
The other guy Kearney was more than likely referring to was Randy Kraft. Kearney claimed to be disgusted by the macabre nature of many of the unsolved killings and refused to take responsibility for them. And very soon, more mutilated bodies started turning up with features that were disturbingly familiar.
Victims, they were molested, they were injured, kept alive while he was torturing them. Hard to describe, and it makes me just sick to think about him.
One of the things he did was he put ballpoint pens in their penises. Who in heaven's name would even think of doing that?
Maybe this is about sexuality, his own potential internalized homophobia, where he has a hatred for the men that he finds attractive. Maybe he hates them because they have this power over him that he can find them attractive, and he doesn't like that in himself.
The bodies of the mutilated young male victims continued to pile up, 9 more through 1978 and 1979. In the summer of 1980, the police once again believed they had caught the culprit, William Bonin, who confessed to 21 murders, gaining the moniker the Freeway Strangler. But just 2 months later, the nightmare for victims and detectives began again.
Bonin was caught, but the killings went on, so it couldn't have been Bonin.
For a while there, we thought that the freeway killings were over and they got the freeway killer. But then the bodies started to come again, and we realized there was somebody else out there. And the cops admitted it too.
In the meantime, 35-year-old Long Beach computer programmer Randy Kraft had got a new job for an aerospace firm and had begun traveling around the US on business. Michigan and Oregon were places he frequently visited. In December 1982 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Detective Ed Rusticus from the Kent County Sheriff's Office was alerted to the discovery of 2 male bodies.
I was sent as an investigator to kind of a remote location. It was December 7. We did have a lot of frost and snow. The bodies were quite frosted over. In fact, when they were taken in, they had to be unthawed before work could be done on them.
Police were quick to identify the 2 victims who disappeared 2 days earlier.
They were called Dennis Alt and Christopher Schönbrunn. They were cousins, and they were both going to a horticultural show.
There happened to be a huge convention in Grand Rapids at the Amway Grand. And this huge convention focused in on the apple industry. That's why these young fellows were at that convention. It just so happened that Randy Kraft was also at that hotel.
And they were never seen alive again.
The double murder was an unusual crime in the agricultural heartland of Michigan.
These cases had a profound effect on the community of Grand Rapids because the victims were from well-known, well-respected farm families. They themselves had no criminal behavior, and this was totally incomprehensible.
When Chief Medical Examiner Stephen Cole inspected the bodies, he found that both young men had been strangled to death. No easy feat for a single attacker.
How did he get these 2 young men into a situation where he was able to strangle them without a great struggle?
The one fellow was a very popular wrestler at West Catholic High School.
The fact that he could subdue two means he must have got him drunk or under the influence or some way to have control over him.
Toxicology tests discovered both men's blood alcohol levels were twice the legal driving limit.
Not enough to probably render them unconscious. However, combined with the Valium, they certainly could have been unconscious or at least lethargic and not able to vigorously defend themselves from being strangled.
One of the victims had been left nude, the other had his pants pulled down.
I found that a pin from the Amway Grand Hotel had been inserted up the urethra, so I haven't seen anything like that before or after.
Detectives in Grand Rapids had little to go on to solve this brutal and unusual crime.
We basically had no evidence, no knowledge of individuals, and we researched a lot of things with a lot of people to try to ascertain who might be responsible. We did some things that I would never in my life do, is watch horrific movies involving sex crimes. To try and get into somebody's mind, who is this guy? We didn't know what we were even dealing with.
Rusticus and his team followed every line of inquiry, contacting police forces across the United States in pursuit of similar cases. 5 months later, they heard about a traffic stop in Southern California that stopped investigators in their tracks.
At 1:10 in the morning of May the 14th, 1983, 2 California Highway Patrol officers spot a Toyota Celica weaving down the road.
As the officers approached the car, they saw 2 men in the front. The driver was identified as 38-year-old Randy Kraft.
The officer noticed a young man looked unconscious in the passenger seat, and he tried to wake him up, wasn't successful.
But of course, he's not asleep. He's dead.
The patrol officers on the I-5 freeway in Mission Viejo had been expecting a routine traffic stop with a suspected drunk driver. Instead, they encountered a suspicious death that would launch a murder inquiry. His passenger was 25-year-old Marine Terry Gambrell.
He was dead. Ligature marks around his throat, as if somebody were behind him with maybe a belt. The young man's pants were pulled down to his knees.
The weaving and erratic driving occurred is because he was actually literally cutting off his penis as he was driving.
It was clear to patrol officers that they'd happened upon something highly unusual, and the mutilated Marine was just the beginning.
When the police searched Kraft's vehicle, they found a lot of drugs. They found photographs of unconscious or deceased males.
Even more significantly, in the boot, there is discovered a ring binder with 61 notes.
The sheet of lined paper was a handwritten list in 2 neat columns, beginning with stable and ending with what you got. When homicide detectives examined the list and the dozens of pornographic photos, it dawned on them that they'd stumbled on the killer they'd been hunting for over 10 years.
Kraft is simply charged with the murder of Terry Gambrell. The police, of course, get a search warrant for his house and discover all manner of trophies, things he's taken from people, littering the house. It's a sort of treasure trove of forensic evidence.
In the garage was a collection of mismatched shoes, belts, clothing, a razor and a backpack, none of which appeared to belong to Randy Kraft. Michigan detective Ed Rusticus was alerted to Kraft's capture by Californian investigators who recognized the similarity between their unsolved cases and the murders of cousins Dennis Alt and Christopher Schoenborn. The young men had fallen into Kraft's clutches while he was on a business trip in the Grand Rapids area.
I was part of the search warrant at his home in Long Beach, and we actually found our victim's personal items in Randy Kraft's house. He kept a souvenir from each victim, at least one souvenir.
When details of Kraft's reign of terror were shared, police in Oregon also came forward with at least 6 similar unsolved murders. It appeared that every business trip had been an opportunity to kill. By studying the Polaroid photos of dead young men, detectives from across 3 states were able to link a number of their cold case victims with Kraft. But the killer refused to confess.
I don't think Kraft talked at all. I know several of the detectives that I dealt with out in LA, and they said he never talked, never said nothing. No, didn't acknowledge anything. There was no information gathered other than physical evidence which tied him to so many different scenes.
There was a beer bottle on one of the victims. It was broken, and his thumbprint was identified as being at the bottom of that bottle.
In May 1983, Kraft was charged with 4 more California murders from earlier that year, including victims Jeffrey Nelson, Robert Loggins, Roger Duvall, and Eric Church. The following month, Kraft was charged with the 1975 torture killing of Mark Hall. Meanwhile, investigators set to work to decipher Kraft's coded list from the boot of his car.
The list was very convincing to me that that was a list of people he'd killed. It was 60 or 70 names on it, but they weren't names. It was shorthand, like Marine.
The law enforcement was able to interpret the list and come up with the names of victims that fit the description on the coded list. For example, it would be jail out, and the victim was abducted after he was released from jail. Or Airplane Hill was the location where this one victim was abducted.
It's thought by the police the acronym for Duckett was stable because he worked in a bar called the Stables.
Parking lot referred to Keith Crotwell, the victim he'd got away with killing in 1975. The coded item 2 in 1 hitch was believed to reference 2 young men he'd picked up hitchhiking together in February 1983. Photos of both deceased victims were also found in his home.
In many ways, he killed so many times, it was a way to itemize it, because he really would want to relive these murders.
By September 1983, Kraft had accrued 39 criminal charges for murder, robbery, sodomy, and mayhem committed in California between 1972 and 1983. 5 years later, in 1988, he stood trial at the Orange County Courthouse, accused of 16 murders, 2 counts of sodomy, and 1 of emasculation. Prosecutors felt confident they could prove to a jury beyond reasonable doubt.
He had the Michigan cases and the Oregon cases. They were brought into trial, but he wasn't charged with them in California.
It was an extraordinary affair. More than 160 witnesses, 1,000 exhibits, 16 victims.
Frederick McBride was a criminal defense lawyer assigned to the case for the preliminary hearing. Kraft pleaded not guilty, refusing to accept his lawyer's advice.
The evidence was absolutely overwhelming. They found a dead body in his car with him. They found mementos at his house. They found his fingerprints at the scene. Nobody was ever going to convince a jury he didn't do it. He wanted to get on the stand and convince everybody he wasn't that kind of person.
He was getting a kick out of being in a trial and having him be the center of attention.
The trial went on for 13 months, becoming one of the most expensive trials ever held in California. $10 million in those days. A great deal of money.
The prosecution painted a picture of a relentless sadist who preyed on innocent young men.
Randy Kraft is like a shark, a killer shark, always circulating at night, always looking to kill somebody, to eat somebody. His eyes never shut, he just kept on driving, always looking, always on the hunt.
Randy Kraft had a way of dealing with people, and he ended up being able to talk these individuals to getting in his car and leaving.
The defense allegation was that he was an upright citizen and he had done none of these things. They were all the victims of William Bonin and Patrick Kearney. Nothing to do with Randy Kraft. It's an outrage to suggest they were.
In the face of overwhelming evidence, the jury did not believe 44-year-old Randy Kraft's protestations.
Finally, in May 1989, Randy Kraft is convicted of all the murders and of one count of sodomy and one of emasculation. It took the jury 11 whole days to come to that conclusion.
You feel grateful that you've been able to ascertain who the killer is, but your most gratifying thing is for the family members that may have some closure. But how can family members even have closure when they have their loved ones killed?
Kraft was also accused of other crimes during the penalty phase, including the molestation of the 13-year-old boy in 1970, the murder of 6 young men in Oregon, and Dennis Alt and Christopher Schoenborn, the 2 cousins in Michigan. On the 29th of November 1989, Randy Kraft was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin Prison in California.
He got the death penalty. I don't think anybody struggled with it too hard.
Despite Kraft's convictions for 16 murders, a chilling theory persists that this was merely the tip of the iceberg. If, as detectives believe, the scorecard was a tally of victims, his killing spree could have been over 4 times that, with scores of unidentified bodies that remain unrecovered to this day. For those involved in the case, it's one that will stay with them forever.
I've investigated a lot of murders in my career, and these murders were extensive, brutal killings that involved mutilation of body parts. These are more than evil killings.
Never had I ever had anything to do with anybody like Mr. Kraft or his crimes. And the truth of it, it changed the way I looked at the world. It comes into my head frequently. You did what? How is that possible you would do such a thing? It's like he's not a human being.
Between 1972 and 1983, Randy Kraft hunted for innocent victims across Southern California. He drugged, raped, mutilated, and murdered at least 16 young men. But the list that earned him the nickname the Scorecard Killer suggests that more than 60 innocent people suffered agonizing deaths at his hands. For the brutality of his murders and the sheer number of victims, Randy Kraft will forever be known as one of the world's most evil killers.